Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Bywater. I'm a compliance lawyer based in London, and obviously GDPR is very much at the top of the list of compliance matters for the moment. And I'm just going to quickly skip through, in the sort of 15 minutes of fame that I have, some key things to think about with a particular focus on security. And there you can see on my first slide, keep calm and don't panic. Yes, GDPR may seem like a bit of a tall order. There's quite a bit of work to be done. Maybe some of you are making good progress on that. But my firm belief is that it is manageable. As long as you have a plan and you're looking at like high risks, key things you need to do, like sorting out your privacy policy and things like that, hopefully it'll all be smooth sailing. As you know, the 25th of May of this year, 2018, is the day that GDPR goes live. Of course, many of you are trying your best to be compliant by that date. My guess is that nobody's going to be fully compliant, but I think the best way to look at this is that 25th of May is basically just the start. So, excuse me for those of you who are familiar with the basic jargon, but lawyers are always accused of using lots of horrible jargon. But for those of you who aren't aware of some of the key issues, key terms, I just thought I'd very quickly go through some of those. Personal data. Remember, we're talking here about any information that relates to an identified or unidentifiable person under GDPR and data protection laws in Europe. That's a very wide concept. It's wider than the US concept of PII, personally identifiable information. That obviously includes things like your email address, which are obvious, or your name and your passport, but there are other things that might not be so obvious to people, such as things like IP addresses. So it's very wide. And similarly, the concept of data processing is very wide. And here by data processing, I mean data processing in the sense, or in the data protection sense, not the IT sense. Data processing in the data protection sense is basically any type of operation you are performing on personal data. So whether you're storing it, you're deleting it, you're moving it, whatever you're doing, as it says somewhere on our regulator's website, that's the ICO in the UK, it's very hard to think of something that is not processing. So again, think of that as a wide concept. Who's who? Well, the data subjects are you and me, the people who are the subject of personal data. And then we have the two concepts that sometimes cause people a bit of trouble, and I do understand that, data controllers and data processors. Now, to put it in very simple, general terms, traditionally the data controller has been, if you like, the master, the person who tells you this is what you can do with my data and only that, and so on. They determine for what purposes that personal data is going to be processed. The processors are the ones who process that data for a controller. That is someone who's other than your employee if you're the controller. The classic example there is, let's say you're outsourcing your payroll. So you, your company, you're sending all that personal data out to the payroll company who are going to be processing it in terms of sorting out payroll. And as I say, traditionally, it's been this kind of master and slave relationship. But things have changed under GDPR, and processors now have far more responsibilities, far more liability, far more obligations. And this is certainly where, in what I've been doing, helping people to comply with GDPR, we've seen there have been quite a few issues in terms of negotiating things like indemnities, checking that your insurance is right, and so on. Because the controller is still ultimately the liable entity, but as I say, the processors have got a lot more responsibilities now. And that's a very key thing also as regards security as well, because obviously the processor has to keep all that's you, the controller's data, secure. Now, very quickly, if you're really panicking about GDPR, always think about this slide here. What are the 6 principles? These are the things that should be guiding you with whatever you're doing in terms of trying to comply with the GDPR and data protection rules. So always go back to this, think about these 6 key things. You can have them like on a postcard in front of your desk. And those are that you have to process data lawfully, fairly, and transparently. What does that mean in practical terms? Well, let's start with your privacy notice. The privacy notice should be saying the basis on which you're processing people's data. For example, if they're entering details into your website. For many of you, that will be the lawful basis will be consent. Then number 2, what we call purpose of limitation. That means you can only collect personal data for very specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes. That means, for example, if you're in marketing, you're collecting data from somebody, you're getting consent for that, for certain marketing purposes, but you're not going to do it for other things. At the very least, you have to be telling people what you're doing. This goes back to point 1, in a transparent way. Say, this is what we're going to use your data for, X, Y, Z, and so on. Then number 3, data minimization. The question there you can say is, do I really need all this personal data? Really keep as little as you really need. Make sure it's only what's really necessary for what you're doing with it. And then number 4 is accuracy. I think that speaks for itself. And then 5, it's a little bit unhelpful in GDPR because it says simply keep personal data for no longer than is necessary. You may say, well, how long is that? And it's very much up to you, but you can come up with protocols and schedules to decide when to delete data, and I believe there's technology out there that can help you with that. And then number 6, last but by no means least, processing securely. This is the big number 1 pain point, the big issue that we all have to be very careful with. The key aims, as you know, of GDPR, you've probably heard it, is that there's supposed to be data protection by design or default. That means that from the get-go, you're supposed to be ensuring that whatever you're doing, let's say you buy a new piece of software or something like that, or don't forget that hard copy data, you're rearranging the office, whatever it is you're doing, that you are making sure that you're complying with GDPR. And the way you look at that, particularly from an IT perspective, where it's really important, is you do these data protection impact assessments. Those, as you may know, are compulsory under certain circumstances, but generally I'm finding that everybody's thinking these are a very good idea to do anyway, and they're a very good business sell for your product as well. Because you can say, look, we did our data protection impact assessment, we've gone through this, we think everything's fantastic, here you go kind of thing. And again, just another plug there, as it were, do be careful because there are these extra obligations for data processors that we have to be careful with. And as I say, security ties in with all of this because when you're doing your data protection impact assessment, for example, you will be looking at security issues. As I'm sure you've heard it many times before, and sorry for the reminder, there are major consequences of getting it wrong under GDPR. You've heard about these big fines. And I'm not making this up. You may have seen already last month, because we're already in February, in January, in the UK, Carphone Warehouse got a fine of €400,000 because their WordPress software was out of date. So all they had to do was basically update that data, the software. They failed to do that. I'm simplifying a little bit. They got a $400K fine. That's 4/5 of what the UK regulator can currently fine them. I made a rough calculation. If that fell under GDPR, they'd be looking at a fine of $423 million. And don't forget that if you do get things horribly wrong, a regulator can also order you to cease processing. So what is the security obligation under GDPR? Well, it tells us in rather broad terms that controllers and processors have to have appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure a level of security appropriate to the risk. So there's a risk approach here. You've got to decide in terms of how you're going to secure data, what the risks are, and how you can meet those. And we've given some examples under GDPR of things you can look at. For example, you can pseudonymize your data. That means that you've got like a key one end, someone's got the key the other end, you put the 2 bits together, and you know what you can go back and work out what the personal data is. Give you a stupid example. With my colleague, if we email things about clients or whatever, we'll do our best not to use the client names. We'll say, you know, client A, client B, whatever. My colleague knows who I'm talking about. He knows who I'm talking about. Very simple example, but even on your day-to-day basis, very important to try and pseudonymize. I hear, unfortunately, every day on the train or the bus or the tube, people talking about all kinds of confidential stuff that's also, in theory, one could say, infringing data protection laws as well. And then encryption is important here. As you can see, it's at the top of the list there. And then you have to make sure that your systems are robust, basically, that everything's, you know, solid and in place. And then in point C, you've got to make sure that if things go horribly wrong, that in a very quick way you can turn that around and restore the data. And then finally, you've got to have some kind of process for regularly testing your systems. What is a breach? Well, the problem is if you have a security problem, you may be committing a data breach. As you can see there from the definition I've taken from GDPR, it's a very wide scope. Anything that concerns destruction, loss, unauthorized disclosure, which is a very common one, that can constitute a breach. And as you may have heard, what's very new under GDPR is we now have mandatory breach reporting. And you are supposed to do that within 72 hours after you have become aware of the breach. Believe you me, that's a tall order. I've already been working on breaches with people under the current regime, and we do simulations as well, and just trying to put together that material, get someone to decide about it. Obviously, there's all the IT work you have to do. Believe you me, that's a real stretch. And guess what? How many of these happen on a Friday afternoon? Many, unfortunately. There is a caveat, though, to the breach reporting. If there's no risk for people's rights and freedoms, phrased in, I know, rather vague legal terms, then you don't have to notify. For example, you copied one person on an email, and it really has almost insignificant information in that email. Forget about it. The ICO are not going to want to know. But that doesn't mean that one email copied to one person might not be something you'd have to report. Let's say, for example, that one email contained a medical dossier. Then you'd have to report that. So every case has to be judged on its merits. And then remember that also under GDPR, if you're reporting to a regulator, you also have to communicate knowledge of that breach to those people who've been affected by it. There's no 72-hour time limit there, but you are supposed to do that as quickly as possible. Fortunately here, I say fortunately, there are some more exceptions to that. For example, where the data has been encrypted. So what can you do next in terms of key things to think about? Well, I'm sure you already have it in place, but if you don't, have an overall compliance plan. People I work with, we usually come up with a dozen things. I've touched on some of them, like getting your privacy policy into place. Training is obviously very important. Second there, you should really have a data protection impact assessment process. You'll find that's a very, very useful tool. And it may seem daunting at first, but believe you me, once you've gone through your first one, you'll see that it's not as tricky as it seems. And then thirdly, have that data breach response plan. As I said, you've got those 72 hours to respond. You need to have something that you can put in, let's say, just a few pages. Point one, we think we've had a breach. Report it. Complete the breach form. Number two, meeting of these three people who decide the next steps. Who's the decision maker? And so on and so on. It's really a practical plan, and you need to fire drill that. Do prepare it and rehearse it. And then I've highlighted in red, well, I would say this, wouldn't I? Invest in proper technologies. Good investment can mitigate the risk of a large fine. I gave you the example of Carphone, who had WordPress software that was out of date. Had they changed that, they wouldn't be paying not only the $400,000, but people's fees like me. And then finally, those vendor contracts. Remember I told you you have these controller and processor contracts, like the outsourcing of HR. You need to put in there, if you don't already have it, clauses that say, I, the processor, have discovered that there is this data breach, and I'm reporting it to you, the controller, so that you can now report it on to the ICO. And there's some other details you'll need to get in there. So make sure you've got all of those things in place. I know there's a lot more to do, but security really is the big pain point, I think, and it's going to be the big issue for many people. But I think if you think about all these things that you can put in place, you can mitigate your risk to a certain high level. That's me. I'm now going to hand over to Kevin. Thank you very much for listening, and obviously I'm around for questions as well.
Thanks, Andre. That was very insightful. And as Andre talked about, as mentioned, there are major implications in the GDPR in terms of how you process data. And the name of the webinar is the Achilles heel file transfer. And so it seems that a lot of people overlook these basic internal processes of moving data. And so we're going to talk about that, explore that a little bit, and why it's so important to focus on that area. Ipswitch, too, is going through a GDPR process, so we're very much on top of that. We also have to qualify our product to make sure it's secure. So we'll talk about how it applies. Andre mentioned that any kind of data processing applies. That actually includes taking files out of a system, putting them in a file share. And as you'll see, probably the closest regulation to the GDPR that we have in the U.S. is the HIPAA requirement for healthcare data. And there have been substantial fines already, and we're not a heavy fining country, but there's been substantial fines already for people who just inadvertently leave a file on a cloud-based file share exposed to the internet, unencrypted. And I'm not talking about transfer on FTP, I'm talking about pre-transfer, being in a file folder someplace up on an Azure share or something like that. So these are all things that you have to worry about. We're going to go kind of in more detail through the things that you should look at. But the basic principle is, you know, all of us today, if we're dealing with data, we've got layers of security that protect the data that sits inside of our IT environment. We've got our moats, we've got our firewalls, we've got our DLP processors and stuff like that. But then we take that data, most of us take that data and share it externally with something. And today, it's a very large part of business for many industries to share data, and in fact, data that is personal data. Certainly that qualifies under the law for the GDPR. Any data that you're externally sharing for somebody to do outsourced processing for you, as Andre mentioned, payroll in the healthcare, you have to send data to payers to find out if they're qualified or if they're covered under insurance policies. In finance, you're sending data out for check processing. All that type of stuff is covered under GDPR. And that is a weakness, and that's where a lot of the fines are happening around the world against data protection regulations in South Korea, in California, and all sorts of places. There have been substantial fines for this inadvertent exposure of data during the processing of that data. So again, looking at those principles, we have 7 of them. We slice it a little bit differently, but we're going to kind of compare those principles against the file transfer protection features that you should have in a system. And as it turns out, most people today are reliant on some form of secure FTP or enterprise file sync and share in order to move data around internally and externally between systems and people, and between people. And so, you know, these are things that we really have to pay some attention to. So for instance, if we talk about the tasks that we have, how does data get moved from an internal application system to a file share, to a FTP server, and then notification sent to somebody to download from that server? That data is being processed when it's being extracted from an application and stored in a file share. So you have to be concerned about things like, is that file share exposed to people who may not be authorized to use it for a number of reasons. One reason would be that, you know, somebody who's hacked your system can get that data and steal it. That's an obvious reason. But you also have more subtle reasons, like under the GDPR, you're only supposed to use data for the purpose that you've collected it. And you have to prove that you're doing that you've safeguarded that data so it can't be used for a purpose other than what it's been collected for. So if data happens to be in a file share on an internal folder and it's unencrypted, and somebody accesses that data and puts it to a different purpose, maybe profiling, maybe analyzing that data to determine some demographic profile, that's against the law under the GDPR. You can't do that. So one of the safeguards you want to do there is actually encrypt files once they're removed from the internal application and they're stored someplace, even internally, even under things that are locked down. You need to encrypt those files in that place. So we call that data encryption at rest. Once it's in process, it should be encrypted. That safeguards you against a lot of potential loss factors right there. It's a really big one. Another thing, non-repudiation. You have to prove that the data is being used for the intended purpose. One of those consequences is, did the data, when you sent it to somebody, was it that person that you intended it to get that actually got the data? How do you prove that? You need very good logging, centralized logging, in order to be able to prove that under the accountability principle. And so that non-repudiation is something that is rarely available in standard or secure FTP servers. You need a system that actually does that kind of checking. Another factor, ad hoc file transfer. This has to do with the ability of an employee, say, to access data and then send it to somebody because, you know, maybe Joe over at the insurance company asked a piece of information to clarify a claim process, and rather than go through the normal system, I'm going to send him an email with the explanation that he needs. So I just send that, I attach a file, I feel everything's good. Maybe I'm a little smarter than that, no, email is not secure, so I'm going to put it on my personal Dropbox account and I'll send it to him that way. That's all illegal. So you want to make sure that there are means that employees can use that are locked down, that are secure, that are encrypted in storage and rested in transit, so that they're not unintentionally violating the intent of the GDPR. Obviously, there's other things there, fine-grained access controls. You know, you don't just want people to have access or not access to folders. They have to have access for certain purposes, deletion, editing, copying, you know, that type of stuff, because you also have things that you have to be concerned about. The accuracy principle. Has the data been altered? And then finally, you know, one of the things that you want to look at in this task-based file transfer, that is, you have some kind of an automated system that assures that every time the data is handled in an internal process, that it's handled the same way. A lot of us do that through scripts on FTP servers. And the issue with scripts, if I have a number of FTP servers in a number of different departments doing a number of different things, they're probably on a number of different platforms, and they're probably running different scripting languages. When the author leaves, nobody knows what that script says. Nobody can assure that it's compliant or keep it updated. So having some type of a centralized task-based system where you can actually look at the tasks and know that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing is really important, and we'll talk about how you can solve that problem. It's a particularly thorny problem that has driven a lot of business for, as we'll talk about, managed file transfer in healthcare and banking around the world, and even in PCI applications, because this is a real thorny problem of FTP servers. So basically, even if you have FTP servers that are secure, they're locked down with SSL or SSH, SFTP, FTPS, or even HTTPS. They're lacking in a number of different ways against this grid. You can see right away there's a lot of things that they can't do. Some of the big ones. Data is not encrypted when it's sitting on the server or when it's sitting in a file share before getting to the server. And this has been a big one where there's been a lot of fines already, not for GDPR, but for other data protection regulations. As I said, somebody uses a file share from Azure, you know, they drop it into file share. It's secure, they think it's secure, but it's not configured properly. Other people can access it. It might even be exposed to the internet. And, you know, there have been huge fines for that in the United States in the last few years. Another one, file integrity checks. You know, can you actually, can you make sure that the file you sent arrives the way that you sent it? That's something that SFTP does, but you can see it doesn't do data encryption at rest, it doesn't do non-repudiation, it doesn't do things like content scanning to make sure nothing's been injected in the data or the data has been altered. There's no remedy for ad hoc file transfer. And then a really big one is the centralized logging. You would have to take all your logs from all your file transfer activities, put them in one place and manage them. Now that might seem like an easy thing to do, but that's one of the biggest driving use cases for people consolidating FTP servers so that they can take care of this. So standard FTP falls short in a lot of different ways. There is a system called managed file transfer which handles all these things. So you have the ability to an easy access for drop, kind of drag and drop file and folder sharing internally and externally for all users in the company so they can be compliant. They don't have to resort to shadow IT mechanisms. Everything is encrypted as soon as it enters the process. You have very fine-grained access controls. You even have alerts for things like, did a task flow get altered? which is a big one for cyber criminals. Go in and hack a workflow, and then you can divert data. So there's a lot of different ways you can see that managed file transfer enables compliance. Any managed file transfer is better than secure SFTP, but of course we're Ipswitch sells Move It, and I want to tell you how great Move It is in that regard. So sorry, I forgot to flip forward on some slides there. So you can see that managed file transfer covers a lot of these things. Now, in terms of what Move It does, it protects data encrypted, and in terms of in process and before when it's being stored on a file transfer folder or file share. It's top level encryption, AES 256-bit encryption. Takes a million years to hack it. You can schedule tasks. It has an automation feature, which means that you don't have to write scripts. You can do drag and drop workflow creation to move folders from place to place. Very simple process. That allows the benefit of being able to see and replace scripts with workflows that anybody can audit, edit, and make sure that they're accurate. You can also set alarms once a workflow has been altered, so you can know whether it's still compliant, etc. And you get this basic end-to-end visibility and control over everything. Everything is in a console in one place. You have reports, you have log files, you have a central place for audits, and this really streamlines the audit capability. And besides all that, you have reliability. Andre mentioned the fact that you need high availability, you need to recover quickly. MFT comes with all sorts of capabilities to support that. Hot spare sites, everything, automatic failover, all that type of capability. And you can document everything that you've actually done. So I encourage you to check out our website also, which has at Ipswitch Solutions /GDPR Compliance, there's a lot of assets there that would help you understand the implications on file transfer, and also, excuse me, a work that we've done in conjunction with Cordery, a flat pack or do-it-yourself data protection impact assessment. He mentioned this is a good step to take in the process for compliance. And we have one up there. You can download it. You can look at your own systems and see what do you need to do to get yourself into a compliance mode. So that's it for my presentation, and I'll hand it back over to Softcat.
Thank you, Kevin. Yes, so as mentioned, if you have any questions, please send them through the Q&A tool on WebEx. And thank you, Andre, for your presentation as well. So just to get things started, if you use a managed FTP server, how do you ensure that the process doesn't become too difficult for the end user, that they divert back to their previous unsecure kind of ways of sharing files?
So we actually do that in a number of ways in the Move It product. There is an Outlook widget that you can use, so you can actually, everybody in the company can load it right into Outlook. If they're going to use email, they just click on this icon that says Move It, and then they can actually send the data, and they know that the data is being encrypted and it's moving through this file transfer process rather than sitting in the Exchange server. And this is actually a big point in what happens a lot of times when you use these shadow IT is the data sits there and is never deleted. And this becomes a treasure trove for hackers who are trying to steal data. Exchange servers, the storage for Exchange servers, file shares that are just sitting there abandoned, FTP servers where files are never deleted. One of the features that we also have is to go set an automated deletion so that if you have a compliance factor, as Andre mentioned, you want to delete data so that it's not sitting out there over a long period of time. You can build that right into the process so it's automatically deleted. The other interface we have is a drag and drop file share for internal and external use. So somebody just says, I have a file on my desktop. It's a desktop client. They drag the file into that client, and it sends it securely encrypted all the way with all these protections. So we do a lot to try and make sure that it's simple enough so that people don't use their iCloud as a file share.
Yep, and definitely a lot of education and awareness needed
yes,
part
for sure.
of that. Thank you, Kevin. So another question is around moving data internally versus externally? Should those two processes look the same, or can they be managed differently?
So there is an assumption there that data that is internal is secure. And just a couple of things I want to say about that. There was a study done by a security firm last year that showed that in the world, there's over 14 million unsecured FTP servers that are configured for anonymous mode, which means you literally, the login is, I think it's like user or anonymous, and the password is password. So anybody can figure that out. And that has there's a lot of data stored on all those servers. So we don't think about all these internal places where we put data as places where data needs to be deleted or secured. And yet, from a hacker standpoint, if I'm into your system, if I get into a spear phishing on anybody's desktop, your receptionist's desktop, and I go looking around the network, I find these treasure troves of data, and I can steal the data. And very often, things like FTP servers also become hosts for command and control centers for hackers. So I think we have to stop thinking about the fact that, you know, internal processes are secure because we have a firewall, because that's not true. So in fact, what you really want to think about is if you're taking data, say, from a banking system or from a healthcare system or even your customer resource management system, and you're moving it someplace to another system, to a user, anything like that, it's going to have a temporary place where it sits. And when it sits in that temporary place, it should be secured. There should be access protection for that, and there should also be encryption. A lot of people in the security world say the solution is encryption. Encrypt everything once it comes out of a system. And that's a really good solution because encrypted data can't be used or modified or anything. So that, you know, I think we have to stop thinking about the inside and external. And we also have to think about external processes often have internal components. That's why so many people think, if I'm using secure file transfer, it's encrypted when the person picks up the file. That's true, but it's sitting someplace unencrypted in the process. So that's dangerous assumption. And again, I just point to the fact that you could think this is a vendor assertion, but there have been huge fines. Look up St. Joe's in 2016 in California, medical supply company, hospital that thought they were just trying to figure out how could they use EFSS. One little trial, they put up a file folder with medical data in it, which is protected under our HIPAA laws and high trust laws, and they got something like a $400 million fine because it was exposed for 2 weeks inadvertently to the internet. They can't even prove anybody used the data, and GDPR has the same kind of important requirements.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I know we at Softcat here, we go on the zero trust model, so not assuming that people internally are not malicious, or, you know, a malicious actor can easily access
or even you don't have to assume. There's actually a study that shows that there actually 75% of all data breaches start with an internal action. Either somebody inadvertently doing spearphished or social engineered, but only 25% of those are malicious. So you don't have to worry about, you know, the bad actor inside. It's just people doing dumb things that get people get companies in trouble.
And you have to be careful about those malicious ones. We had a big case in the UK just before Christmas, a court case against a well-known supermarket where we had a very rogue employee who put the stuff out there, and he got, I think it was 6-7 years in jail, but the company was still found liable for his actions, and they have to compensate. We haven't got the figures yet because they haven't taken it that far yet, but they're going to have to compensate a huge amount of their own internal employees. So you do have to be careful of those people too.
Yeah, and Andre, that comes on to another question: is if a file transfer breaches, you know, the data regulation or GDPR, is it both the processor and the controller who are held liable for that?
Well, ultimately it's the controller, unless the processor has gone sort of beyond the remit of what the processor is supposed to be doing. That this is where you have to be, I think, very careful when you're negotiating either your new contracts or you're renegotiating existing contracts to set up the who's going to pay for what, as it were. Because let's say you get a big fine from let's say the UK's regulator, the ICO, the controller may still be looking to get compensation from the processor, and that's why I mentioned before that the processor will want to negotiate some kind of, well, it's the controller who will probably want to negotiate the indemnity, and the processor will more likely want some kind of cap on that. So yes, because you're the processor, I don't assume you're off the hook.
Yeah, I think another implication there, we know that a lot of our regulated industry customers using managed file transfer require some form of managed file transfer for their data partners as well, because it doesn't help if I own the data, I send it out for processing and it gets lost there, I'm still liable, even under most U.S. laws. So it's you know, that's something where you really have to think about who your data partner is and how secure they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, do your due diligence, absolutely.
Another question we have is around, you know, with the rise of Internet of Things, capturing lots of data points in different environments. One of the questions we have is, if the readings are capturing data from an individual's residence, does that classify as their personal data, and does it need to then be managed in accordance with that?
Yes, I mean, if it's personal data that identifies somebody, absolutely. And you have to go through all that rigmarole of on what basis that data is being processed. As I mentioned, one of the first principles is, you know, the lawful basis. And the most common one that most people were dealing with is consent, although there are some other bases as well. But yes, anything that's doing anything with processing the wide term with someone's personal data, you fall within the scope of the rules.
Yeah.
Yes.
Would that be including, you know, your smart devices monitoring the temperature in your home, or kind of capturing GPS locations and things like that?
Yeah. Oh, GPS location. You've got to be very careful with geolocation. Just had a big case in France where if I remember rightly, the main idea was to help. This was to locate people who were going out in vehicles to try and help people. But at the same time, the employer was using it to kind of check on the employee. And this went all the way to court, and the court said, no, you can't use this the way you're doing it to check on what the employee is doing. So there are all kinds of aspects to this for sure.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
Well, if you do your DPIA, and I really am going to plug these again, you know, you can come up with the solutions, seriously. And if you have a real problem on a DPI and you've got something that you can't mitigate, you then have to go to the regulator to try and hammer that out with them. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, and let me also say that Andre says that's important. It is. I mean, that's a huge piece of being able to know whether even your piece of the puzzle, your FTP, is secure. So, again, that's at ipswitch.com/solutions/GDPR-compliance. You can download a free DPIA kit, and it's very helpful.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Andre and Kevin, for presenting to us today and taking those questions.
A pleasure.
Thank you.
If you want to find out more, please visit softcat.com/GDPR.